Hello, welcome. You're watching Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. Trouble for TikTok continues to mount as countries look to clamp down on the social media giant. After 5 hours of being grilled by most bipartisan U.S. Congress leaders and politicians, the TikTok CEO has admitted that Chinese engineers of parent company ByteDance have access to users' data. However, the social media company executive maintained that the company is not an agent for China or any other country for that matter. Let me go across to Zakrzewski, tech policy reporter for the Washington Post. So that was some very aggressive questioning by members of the House committee. How is this likely to go, Kat? Do you expect a ban? Is this what is being contemplated by the U.S. government, an outright ban on TikTok in the United States?
So political momentum is certainly growing for a ban of TikTok. We heard multiple lawmakers, including Kathy McMorris-Rodgers, the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee yesterday, call for a ban of TikTok. The question is how that would work. The White House senior officials in the Biden administrations do not believe that the White House has the authority to ban TikTok without an act of Congress. And so that really puts the ball on Capitol Hill for lawmakers to move forward with legislation known as the Restrict Act, which would grant greater powers to the Commerce Department to move forward with such action.
Would also like to ask you about what is the evidence that the U.S. government and the House committee is working with right now. There have been widespread allegations of surveillance by TikTok, collection of users' data. So what is the kind of evidence that the House committee and the government is working with?
At least in terms of what they've made public, they have limited evidence supporting these claims that TikTok is a national security threat. One of the things that we heard lawmakers talk about again and again is reports that some ByteDance employees were using the company's tools to surveil U.S. journalists who were writing critical stories about the company. But beyond that, most of the risks that lawmakers have brought up to this point have been mostly hypothetical. They're worried that because TikTok's parent company ByteDance is headquartered in Beijing, that could be abused by the Chinese government to force ByteDance to turn over access to American user data. There's also concern that because the company's source code was partially developed in China and because of the operations that ByteDance has there, that the Chinese Communist Party could seek to use TikTok to spread propaganda to Americans.
Right. And what happens next? What action could the House committee take against the TikTok CEO, against the company, its executives in India?
So one thing that we're all watching is, one, will there be more hearings with TikTok CEO Shou? One of the things that I noticed yesterday is that lawmakers from other committees in Congress were actually walking into the room at points. So it's possible we could see him called back to Capitol Hill again for more questions. And then the next big action that we're watching for is, will the U.S. Congress pass legislation that makes it easier for the U.S. government to attempt to ban or restrict TikTok? And again, that's that legislation, the Restrict Act, that has been introduced in the U.S. Senate. But all of this, I think there's big questions as political momentum for a ban builds in Washington. One thing to just remember is that the United States has tried to ban TikTok before under President Trump. And the federal judges in the United States actually blocked those moves, saying that the ban on TikTok ran afoul of the U.S. Constitution, which has protections for free speech. So it's possible that any attempt, whether in Congress or within the Biden administration, could run into similar hurdles.
Right. So there is clearly a judicial hurdle that any action by the U.S. government could run into. Zakrzewski, thank you very much for joining us here on Global Eye, giving us your view and what lies ahead for TikTok in the United States. Shifting focus to global politics now. Earlier this week, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Moscow for the first time since the Ukraine war to hold talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Xi Jinping attempted to broker a peace deal between the two nations using China's plan, which it proposed last month. Putin said that China's proposal could be used as a basis to end the war. However, Ukraine ruled out any possibility of talks unless Russia withdraws from its territory. In a joint statement, Russia and China condemned using multilateral platforms to push political agendas. Let me now go across to former Deputy NSA Pankaj Saran, also the former Indian ambassador to Russia. Ambassador Saran, let me begin by asking you, how do you see the chemistry between the two leaders? What was the message they were trying to send out to the world? In fact, there was a video of the farewell ceremony where Xi was seen shaking Putin's hand and saying that, "Take care, please, my friend." And Putin held both his hands and said, "Have a safe trip." What do you see from the messaging, from the videos that are doing the rounds about the trip?
Yeah, thank you. I think the relationship between the two leaders goes back many years. So the reason why it has attracted so much attention is because of the current crisis in Ukraine. But otherwise, in terms of the visuals, the chemistry, and the bonhomie, etc., it is fairly typical of the Russia-China summitry process. So I don't see anything unusual in that. Of course, I think there is an element here of the Chinese President Xi Jinping standing in solidarity with the Russian president. And they are both, in their own ways, in some form of a siege from the West. So that is something that brings them together.
Right. Asking you about the peace plan, of course, that has been rejected by the West and also by Ukraine. So the Chinese president suggested a 12-point plan, which could be the basis for some sort of resolution. How do you see this? What are the intentions of both sides? Is the intention to consolidate the territorial gains even more?
Well, it's interesting, and it's a very typically Chinese diplomatic gambit to decide to put on the table a comprehensive plan on the first anniversary of the war. So they are going to certainly promote this everywhere, including in the United Nations, in the Security Council, and everywhere else. I think the Chinese intention is perhaps to come across as a global statesman, as a global peacemaker, and to project to the West that it has some influence over Russia and that it can actually help in winding down the tensions. Insofar as the chances of success are concerned, as you have pointed out, I don't think there are very good chances because of the Western suspicions over China. And I really do not think the West will allow China the privilege of coming across as this global peacemaker and statesman. Also, there are very serious contradictions in the whole situation in terms of how to reconcile the question of territorial integrity with mutual security concerns. And this is really still a big question mark. So I'm not sure whether the Chinese plan has a way out of this big dilemma which Europe and Russia face.
Ambassador Saran, to also ask you about the reactions we've seen from the likes of US, UK and European Union for the past few weeks. The West has called for sanctions against China in case any kind of direct help with weapons or any kind of monetary help to sustain the Russian war effort is seen. Any evidence of that you're seeing in the last few weeks? And could there be some sort of Chinese support through these deals that were signed during this visit between China and Moscow that could lead to strengthening the Russian effort against Ukraine?
Well, on the sanctions, definitely. I think this is the time when rhetoric is at its height because we are in the thick of emotions, and all this that was said in the last few weeks coincided with the first anniversary of the war. So it was quite expected that we would see heightened rhetoric on both sides. I think there was an element of warning to China about not getting involved militarily into the conflict. Actually, I do not think China is going to get militarily involved in the conflict because of many reasons. Insofar as the Russia-China summit is concerned and the various deals that were signed, I think China is just being opportunistic. It is holding out a degree of comfort to Russia in terms of bailing Russia out of its current position. And obviously, Russia finds it attractive to, to respond. And so there is an element of opportunism in this. But in the medium to long term, definitely the relationship is going to continue to grow as it has been growing for the last many years, regardless of what is happening in Ukraine.
Right. The next question, Ambassador Saran, is on the deals that were signed. Could you weigh in on the importance of some of these agreements, especially as China and Russia were intending to further concretize their no-limits partnership?
Yeah, it's interesting. Almost all the agreements and the joint statement actually were focused on economic and trade and investment issues. I mean, this is interesting because, they talked about how the bilateral trade between the two sides had shot up to almost $185 billion. But if you look closely at the composition of the trade and the balance of trade, it is heavily skewed in favor of China in terms of huge imports by China of energy and raw materials. This kind of a lopsided economic integration between Russia and China, with Russia fueling Chinese economic growth, and in the bargain also earning precious money, I think is going to be, in at least the next couple of years, something which we will have to, which we will see more and more of. The interesting thing is that the share of the dollars in the settlement of the trade has steadily gone up between the two countries. So they are trying to insulate themselves. So one is the trade aspect. The second is the investment aspect. I think the third is the transit aspect. There was talk about Russia becoming a transit between China and Europe. Then I found interesting the reiteration of possible cooperation in the Arctic region, in the Northern Sea route. So there is, so the entire package is actually focused less on the political and strategic, but more on the economic and trade and investment. And I think this is deliberate because they do not want to talk too much about that, although that is in some sense forms the foundation of the entire edifice of the relationship.
My final question, Ambassador Saran, should India be worried by this bonhomie between China and Russia, both countries publicly vowing to shape the geopolitics of the world?
Well, I think it's the West which is actually really worried, and they see this in black and white terms. Insofar as we are concerned, the point to note in the Russia-China relationship is that while we have serious problems of security and border dispute with China, we actually do not have any such problems with Russia. So our objective has to be to keep Russia and India together in an engagement which is insulated from the Russia-China relationship. This is a challenge for us, but I feel that Russia is also conscious of the fact that it does not want to mortgage its relationship with India to China. And we therefore have to watch closely. But if you look at the Eurasian zone, the entire land space and the land mass, I think it's critical for us to keep Russia in play rather than allow a new Russia-China axis, which is hostile or adversarial to India. That would not be in our interest.
All right. Ambassador Pankaj Saran, thank you so much for joining us on a very important topic, a very key meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Putin taking place in Moscow. That's all we have time for on this segment of Global Eye, but don't go anywhere. Lots more coming up. Tens of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets of Israel protesting against judicial reform, some contentious judicial reform.